Today we are joined by Richard Doty. Richard served at Kirtland Air Force Base as a counterintelligence officer. While assigned to Kirtland, Richard was briefed into a special access program that detailed the U.S. government's historical involvement with ETs and investigation of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Richard investigated numerous cases involving the UFOs and extraterrestrial contact by Air Force personnel and involvement on UFOs on, near, or above Air Force bases. One of the most famous UFO contact involved a private security contractor's contact with a landed UFO on base. This case also involved the sighting of UFOs over a nuclear weapons storage area on Kirtland. Richard was briefed into several highly classified projects. One of these projects involved reverse engineering ET spacecrafts, and Richard's job was to safeguard the project utilizing counterintelligence techniques. He also investigates the famous Gate 3 incident, which involved the escape of an ET entity from Area 51. This is highly classified stuff, guys. After leaving the USAF, Richard worked for the Institute for Advanced Studies at Austin. Dr. Hal Puthoff was director and hired Richard to work on special projects. He's worked on several film companies as a technical advisor on movies involving UFOs, UAPs, ET-related subjects. Richard is currently employed by Gaia on Cosmic Disclosure on episodes with Emery Smith. Richard Doty, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. I'm just going to delve right into Paul Bennewitz. Why are we focusing on this case now?
Well, thank you, Kristen, for having me here. Well, the incident regarding Paul Bennewitz occurred back in the late 90s and early 80s. And there's a lot of information that has been presented in the past, but there's new information about that case has been released by the government. And so I'm going to talk about that recently released information and set the story straight on a lot of factual errors that have been developed or created over the years by other UFO researchers. So that's what I'm going to talk about today or tomorrow, and we can go into it as deep as you want to get today.
Brilliant. Let's just delve right in. What factual errors are we talking about? Well,
one of the factual errors is that there was a disinformation campaign directed at Paul Bennewitz. And we did. There was a disinformation campaign, but it wasn't the way some of the people, the critics, are talking about it now. Paul Bennewitz, number one, was a private citizen. He owned a company called Thunder Scientific Laboratories, which was right outside the base of Kirtland. He also had a government contract. His company made sensors and humidity detectors for submarines and spacecrafts. So he had a clearance, industrial security clearance, to work on those type of projects. Paul also was an avid believer in UFOs. He was a member of MUFON and CAUSE, which was one of the earlier UFO groups. And he was also a private investigator for UFOs. So he was a believer in UFOs. When Paul first started taking pictures of strange things occurring at Kirtland Air Force Base, little flying, he's calling little flying saucers flying around airplanes, unidentified lighting that is occurring near the weapons storage area, which was the nuclear weapons storage area, one of the largest nuclear weapons storage areas in the free world. And so Paul was concerned. Paul was a patriotic American. He was a veteran. He served in the United States Coast Guard. So he was concerned. But he continued to gather things over and over. And eventually he thought there was a threat to the base. So Paul decided he would contact somebody at the base. He didn't know anybody in particular except for a woman who lived near him, and she had been associated with the base. Anyways, Paul got the number to the chief of the security police that guarded the Monsanto, which was a nuclear weapons storage area. His name was Ernie Edwards, Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Edwards. He talked to Ernie Edwards on the phone, and he told Ernie what he was photographing, what he was detecting from his house. And Paul lived just outside the perimeter of the base. He could stand on his patio and see the entire base, including the nuclear weapon storage area. So when Colonel Edwards heard the story from Paul Benowitz, he immediately called me on the phone. I was a counterintelligence officer for the base. And Ernie said, Rick, you got to come to the office. I got some information. He didn't want to discuss it over the phone. So I said, what is it about? He says, about a possible threat to the base. Well, that perked my curiosity up, obviously, because one of our main reasons for being in counterintelligence is to protect the base. So I went to Ernie's office, and he tells me the story that he had just been told by Paul Benowitz. I thought, wow, he's taking pictures, he's doing this? Yeah. Well, I knew a lot of classified projects were occurring on Kirtland. I was briefed on it. My job was protect these classified projects, myself and my staff. There were other intelligence officers. When Ernie told me about what Paul Benowitz was photographing, I immediately knew what it was. Back in those days, the United States Air Force had a secret, highly classified drone program. They were experimenting with drones. And the way the Air Force did it back in those days, and now this is in the late 70s, early 80s, they would fly a plane, and then they would launch these little drones out of the plane, because the controller has to be in close proximity. We didn't have the satellite control system that we have nowadays, but so the plane had to be close to these things flying around, these drones. Now, if you're on the ground and looking up in the air and you see this big plane, which was it was called an EC-135, or similar to a 707 civilian craft, and you see all these little things flying around it, you're going to think, oh my God, there's flying saucers flying around this Air Force plane. And Paul was photographing this. So I knew then, I put two and two together. So anyways, I made an appointment, went out and talked to Paul, went to his home. Went to his laboratory, his office, a private plant, which was right outside the base. And I said, I introduced myself, and I said, you talked to Colonel Edwards, and I'm here to investigate it. I'm the counterintelligence officer for the base. And Paul immediately opened up on everything he thought was important, including the photographs he'd taken. Towards the end of that conversation, he talked about these strange signals that he was detecting from the base. Now that perked my curiosity, because I didn't know what those signals could have been. I said, are you talking about radio signals? He said, no, they're stranger than radio signals. They're higher up on the frequency chart. I said, wow, that's interesting, Paul. How are you doing this? And he said, well, you come to my house and I can show you what I'm doing. So I eventually made an appointment, with him. When our schedules corresponded, it was an evening. I wanted to do this in the evening. And I brought along with me somebody that was a scientist, somebody that investigated UFO sightings in the past, and his name was Jerry Miller. Jerry Miller was a civilian employee of the Air Force Test and Evaluation Center on Kirtland. And so Jerry and I went out, and I'd worked with Jerry before on projects. He was an expert in scientific areas, and I wasn't. I was a counterintelligence officer. I didn't have a background in science. My background was in just education and political science. So we went out there, and Paul explained everything he was doing. He showed us the cameras, the advanced Canon AE-1 camera with this long lens that was out on his patio. He had a radiation detector, a long-range radiation detector. He had a Gauss meter that detected electromagnetic beams. He had a signal or frequency collector. And well, immediately when I saw these things, I obviously, my expertise was in intelligence and espionage and collection of espionage, counter-espionage. And I thought, wow, is this guy a spy? My first reaction was, this guy's collecting stuff he's not supposed to collect. But we just talked to him. He showed us everything that he was doing. And Jerry took some photographs. He allowed us to take photographs. And so Jerry and I went back to the base. and went to our office, and Jerry laid it out on the table, and he says, well, he explained what each item was that Paul had on his patio, how he was collecting, what he was collecting. I said, do you think he's a spy? And Jerry says, that's a possibility. I said, well, why would he be showing us this if he was a spy, you know? I mean, spies hide stuff. And I mean, I've chased spies before, and they don't show you things that they're using against you. So we gathered all this information. I wrote a real detailed report and sent it up to the headquarters, my headquarters. And I waited for a response from headquarters. Well, not more than, that was in the next day, on a Friday, at 6 o'clock in the morning, we had our own communication system in the OSI office. And the person that ran that, I came in the office at 7:30, and she immediately brought this stuff down to me. It was classified top secret with a special access program. She said, and she had it in her case. Well, I knew then it was really highly classified, but I didn't connect it, first of all, to Paul. I said, what do you got there? She says, here. So I had to open the box, and she has a key, I have a key, and I bring the stuff out, and it's a response to what I sent up there. It was very detailed about what they think he's doing and what he shouldn't be doing, and what he probably took pictures of, which was the secret drone program. So we had to create an operational plan to target him in some manner that he would know, to basically disinform him, disinformation project. Now, in the military or in the intelligence community, we didn't do anything without an operational plan. I mean, you know, we used to kid, hey, you got to go to the bathroom, you got to have an operations plan to go, you know, one of those things. So I drew up an outline of what I think we should do, and I sent it up to headquarters. Well, headquarters sent me down an operations plan and said, you will follow this. You know, we appreciate what you want to do, but we're going to do it this way. Of course, I have to follow their instructions. And so I had to try to convince Paul that what he was seeing and what he was filming was in fact UFOs and not a classified project such as a drone program. Because during that time period, the drone program was very highly classified because very few countries had that. We knew the Soviet Union had it, and the Soviets wanted to know what we were doing. Of course, we want to know what they were doing. I mean, spy versus spy in the espionage game, so to speak. So I went to Paul, and I sat down with him, and I had numerous contacts with him over a period of years. And I said to Paul, what do you think this is, Paul? And Paul says, I know what it is. It's UFOs. It's aliens. I said, you really think these are aliens? He said, I know they are. I said, you know what? I think you're right. Now, that's as much of much information that I provided to Paul regarding the disinformation. I didn't have to convince him anything more than that. I just had to agree with him. He took it and ran it from there. So all these false stories about us, psychologically torturing him and planting things in his mind and bugging his house and all these things, that's not factual. I would come out, he would call me and say, I got this information, I got that. So we finally convinced him not to take any more pictures, okay? Because all he was doing with the pictures was keeping them. He wasn't sharing with anybody. And we trusted him. The first thing I said to Paul was, you know, Paul, I don't think you should share these pictures with anyone. He said, I'm not. I understand what classification is. I don't want to lose my government contract. I'm not going to share them with anybody. I said, can we keep them? Can you give them to us so we can keep them? Sure. So he gave us everything, and we would keep them and store them. Actually, we sent them up to headquarters. Now, the second part of this is that the signals that Paul was detecting was strange, and Air Force didn't really know what they were. We didn't have the expertise in that area. But we knew that the base, I knew that the base had a National Security Agency facility on base. And they were the experts in signals and so forth. So I went and spoke with one of their intelligence officers. We were always at weekly meetings together on the base in a secure room talking about the threats and so forth. And I briefed him into the Benowitz case. And the operational plan that was named, this came from headquarters, was 7 lambs. That's the plan, that's the operational plan against Paul Benowitz. So I briefed him into it, and he says, well, I think he tapped into something that we're doing out here. Now, I had general knowledge of what they did out there, but I didn't have detailed knowledge because everything within the government intelligence is compartmented. You know, if you don't have a need to know, you're not going to know. Okay, and that's a fallacy that just because you have a top secret security clearance with special access doesn't mean you know everything. You have to have a need to know, and then they give you that access. So I said, well, what is it? What did he tap into? He said, well, I can't tell you. It's a really highly classified. I said, okay, well, I need to get clearance on it because I need to know what you're doing out here. Well, he stagnated. He procrastinated in getting me the clearance. So eventually, Paul got a computer, and he was telling me he was collecting signals from the ETs. And I said, how do you know it's signals from the ETs? He said, they're sending their alphabet or their characters, almost like Chinese characters. I said, how are you getting them, Paul? He said, they're just showing up on my screen. So this is where things turn drastically from us providing disinformation to Paul to protect a highly classified Air Force project to what Paul's collecting. We went out there, and I took Jerry Miller with me, and we sat there, and I watched the monitor. Now, this is 1980s stuff. A Commodore, I don't know if anybody understands what a Commodore computer was, but the screen was just like a Commodore. It's black and white. It's not colored. And I was watching these things appear. And, well, Jerry Miller's watching it, and we couldn't figure out, because I'm not an expert in that area. And Jerry he wasn't a computer expert either. He was just a scientist. And Jerry says, I don't know how he's doing that. So then we bring in a computer expert, one of our own, OSI computer expert. And he said, I don't know how he's doing that. But these figures are showing up on his screen, and these characters. And so we took his computer back to the base. They took it to the computer lab. They took the thing apart, put it back together, trying to figure out where the signals are coming, and they couldn't find it. So I'm thinking, does Paul really have contact with somebody? I mean, is that possible? But I'm still thinking it had connections to NSA. So one night we were at, myself and another agent, one of my partners in counterintelligence, were at Paul's house for dinner. They invited us to dinner, and we had dinner. And we went out. We looked out of his bedroom window, and the view is into the street. And there's a house across the street. And I'm looking at the house, and I see this red light, like one on a camera, going on and off. And I looked over there, and I asked Paul, I said, Paul, who lives over there? Paul said, that's a vacant house. I said, no, I don't think it's vacant. Paul, look. I said, that red light's going on and off. It's like a camera. Paul says, no, there's nobody in the house. I said, well, there's somebody in there. It's taking pictures of you. So myself and my partner go downstairs, and we're federal agents. We can carry guns, so we're going to go over there and find out who's over there. Somebody break into the house. So I called Albuquerque Police Department and had contacts there, and I said, yeah, he sent a patrol up here to Fort Hills, where Paul lived. And so 2 officers come up there, and I'm telling them it's not anybody's supposed to be living there, and so forth and so on. So as the 4 of us approach, these 2 men come out. And there's 2 cars parked in the driveway. And an APD officer says, what are you guys doing here? He said, we're renting this place. I said, and they said, oh, okay. Well, you're not supposed to be, nobody's supposed to live here. He said, no, we're renting a place. So one of them went up and got a rental contract. I said, yeah, okay, here we are. I said, who you guys work for? I identified myself. He said, we work for a car rental company. I said, Avis. I said, you work for a car rental company? And you got a camera up there photographing the house across the street? Now, I didn't tell this to the Albuquerque police officers, but they looked at me like, oh, wow. And they said, we were just photographing the scenery. At 9 o'clock at night? In rain, it was raining. It was light rain falling in Albuquerque during that time. And they said, yeah, what's wrong with that? I said, well, I don't believe a word you're saying. And the Albuquerque police officers, can we go up and look? Nope, you can't, unless you have a warrant. Well, you didn't have a warrant, so. Anyways, I took the license numbers off the vehicles. I thought, what are 2 employees of Avis doing? Sounds far-fetched to me. Sounds like something an intelligence officer would try to throw at people. So anyways, we left, and we went back to the base. I ran those plates through a system, and they come back to a rental car company, but not Avis, in Denver. I thought. So we had their names. So I thought, these guys are with either NSA. I know they weren't DIA because I worked for DIA, or some other government agency. They weren't the FBI. So I did some research. I went back out and talked to Alan Ferguson, the NSA guy, and I said, you got 2 options here, Mr. Ferguson. You can tell me what you know about Paul Benowitz, or I'm going to wait here. I'm going to get my own warrant, and I'm going to get it from headquarters. He said, well, give me about 5 minutes. So he goes in, he makes some phone calls and this and that, and he comes back and he said, okay, I'll tell you. He said, yeah, we're investigating him. I said, last night we confronted 2 of your guys. Yeah, I know, we know. He reported it. I said, why didn't you coordinate with me? You're interfering with a federal investigation. I mean, we have an investigation going on, and I briefed you on it. Now you bring your 2 people out here, and you're investigating the same thing we're investigating, but you're not sharing the information with me. That's unacceptable. And that's not professional. So then I was briefed in. And what Paul was doing, first of all, the NSA facility there at Kirtland had a laser, a high-energy laser. And what they were doing is when a Soviet satellite came over the base, the laser would be directed towards the opening of where the Soviet camera is and blind the satellite. So the Soviets couldn't take pictures. Now, that used to be highly classified. It's not classified anymore. There's books written about it. When I was briefed into the program, I thought, okay, he detected that frequency. Now, Paul still didn't know what he was doing, what he was collecting, so I wasn't about to go tell him. He said, but we're in a process of jamming his frequency, of jamming his collection device over there, and he's not going to be able to do this anymore. So I thought, well, wait a minute. Before you do that, let me convince Paul not to direct that over here anymore. I mean, it saves you the opportunity to waste your equipment, and it might save, because I was afraid that some of the signals that they were shooting over there might be harmful to Paul and his wife. Just Paul and his wife that lives there. I said, and Paul was up in there in age, and Paul had a lot of medical problems. So I thought, wait a minute. Well, let me talk to Paul first, and then if that doesn't work, then you can do your thing. So I went and told Paul, I said, Paul, listen, don't shoot your frequency collector over there anymore. I said, because you're interfering with what the government's trying to do out there. Oh, okay, no problem. So he shut it off, took it off his patio, no problems ever since. So I never told Paul that what he was doing and what he was collecting. And the years later I did before he passed away. But so some of the stories is going around about what we did as far as jamming his frequencies and things at his house, bugging his phone. That didn't happen. But what Paul did do, he gave me and gave Jerry and gave Steve, this other intelligence officer, full access to his residence. He gave us his key. He had a cipher lock, an old cipher lock system on his door, so you had to punch in a code to get in. He said, you can come out here anytime you want to. You can look at anything that we have out here, that I have out here. You don't have to. I said, okay. So we did that. Well, there's people out there in the UFO community that said, you surreptitiously entered his home, you did all these things. No. He gave us the key, he gave us full permission. He signed a waiver. So we were doing everything legally. And we had to, because every operation we do, it has to be cleared by our legal division. So, they have to say, yeah, you can do this. Oh, you can't do that. You can do this. No, you can't do that. So, and we were following that. Now, an interesting incident happened at Paul's house some months later. Paul and his wife invited myself, Jerry Miller, and this other agent Steve, over to his house for dinner. And so we went over there and we had a really nice dinner. His wife made a very nice dinner. He lives in a very beautiful home. And we went into this room adjacent to the dining room, and there was a couch. There's a wall. I'm sitting in a couch. Steve, the other agent, sitting next to me. Jerry Miller sitting on my left in a chair, and then Paul sitting next to him. I'm looking at a wall with just a picture on it, and the patio doors is off here to my right. We're sitting there, and we were going to have coffee and brandy. Well, I'm not a brandy drinker, but Paul always drank brandy. So I had coffee, and we're sitting. And while I'm sitting at the wall, I see this orb suddenly appear at the lower left-hand corner. And I'm looking at this orb, and I didn't say anything to anyone else, but Steve nudged me, and I looked over at Steve, and he's going, and I kind of shook my head. But Jerry is over here. He can't see. He's facing the other direction. This orb is traveling up the wall. And I'm watching this orb, and it gets up to the corner. And about that time, as my eyes were moving up to the corner, Paul detects something. He says, oh, you saw it too. So I looked over at Paul, and I said, what is it, Paul? And then Jerry sees it. The first thing Jerry did was I looked over at Jerry, and he said, look at your watch. But I knew what he meant. I looked at my watch, and there were incidents about missing time. When orbs appear, some people miss time. So I looked at my watch. Jerry, he got his watch, and this thing is moving all over the wall. Now, my first reaction was somebody shining like a flashlight with something in front of it on the wall. But I don't see any beams. I'm looking all over. And behind me is a hutch with figurines on it. And then there's another room. And so I'm thinking, oh, how is he doing this? I'm thinking Paul's doing this. Maybe a joke or something. I'm looking, I'm saying, how is he doing this? And all of a sudden it comes out. Now it's three-dimensional. It's in the middle of the room. And I'm watching it, and it's spinning around. And his wife comes in, and she stands. We'd already had coffee, and she was bringing in a pot to pour some more coffee. And she stands in the doorway between this room and the dining room. And she just watches it, and she says, oh, our friend is back. And so I turned over to her, and I said, this happened frequently? And she says, yeah, about every once or twice a week it flies around here. But don't worry, it's not going to harm you any. So I'm watching this thing. Now it's out in the middle of the room, so it can't be a reflection. It can't be a light beam. And Jerry's looking at it. I'm looking at it. I'm trying to visualize every possible scenario. And Steve's saying, oh my God, what the heck could this be? And he's saying out loud. And all of a sudden, it goes up to the top of the ceiling, and he had high ceilings. And it shot back down the corner where it started and disappeared. So I said, I'll take that brandy now. Jokingly, but I actually had one. So I said to Paul, I confront Paul, okay, Paul, how'd you do that? He said, I didn't do that. I said, Paul, I'm a good interrogator. I said, Paul, I don't want any bull. How did you do that? He said, Richard, honest to God, I didn't do that. It just shows up in my house. So I said, Paul, you're going to give us permission to search everything. You can search anything you want. So Jerry went out to his government car, and he had equipment in his trunk. And he brought all this equipment in, and we were trying to see if we could mimic it, or if we could recreate it, or any kind of strange anomalies in the room, any kind of frequencies, electromagnetic frequencies, and it all proved negative. So Paul and I went into his office, which was on the other side of the house, and I sat him down and I said, listen, Paul. He said, I know what you're going to say. How'd I do it? I didn't do it. Honest to God, Richard, I would tell you if I did. I said, this is a joke. If you're playing a joke on us, please tell me. He said, I'm not playing a joke. That happens all the time. Like my wife said, 2 or 3 times a week. We don't know where it comes from. It's our visitors. It's the aliens are doing this, Richard. So, I tried every tactic I could to get something out of Paul, but he just said, no, I didn't do it. So we said, okay, we said goodnight, we left. Jerry says, I got some more equipment we're going to take and put in his house. But we're not going to tell him what we're putting in his house. Now, this is probably the closest we came to a surreptitious entry. We got permission to do this. He had already given us permission. Well, we got legal permission. We went about this in a different way. We went to a federal judge and asked for a surreptitious warrant through FISA, which is a secret warrant. We had to get the FBI involved in this, and we did this all. The judge signs the warrant, and we go in to his house when he's at work and his wife's at work. His wife works at the same building he worked at. And we set up these cameras, set up things in his house. And we left, and we were able to remotely collect what we had, the cameras and so forth, and the other equipment we had in the house. So we ran this, and we only could do it for 30 days, and we had to take it out, and we had to get another warrant. So we did this, and so we collected all this stuff, and we don't find anything. Paul's not generating anything in there. He's not creating anything. Even the conversations, which we've never revealed, we couldn't, between him and his wife, was never around anything that he was doing surreptitiously against us. He was thoroughly convinced that the aliens were contacting him, both with this orb and on his computer. We starting to realize, I sat in the office with my supervisor and other people, and we're saying the same thing. Paul couldn't have done this. Maybe he is in touch with ETs. How? We don't know. Well, jump ahead. Paul's a pilot, a private pilot, had his own plane, and he would fly up around Dulce, New Mexico. Now, that's an entire different subject about what is up at Dulce, what he photographed up at Dulce. But him and one of the workers at his lab flew up to Dulce, and his partner, his employee, was a photographer also, and so the employee was going to take pictures of Dulce from the air. So they did that, and they were flying back. And as they flew back, they were over a place called Red River, New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and they encountered a UFO, a big UFO. And his cameraman took 12 excellent pictures of this UFO. Ironically, the story, when Paul called me and said, I got pictures that you're not going to believe, but you can come to my office laboratory and look at them. He had his own photo lab too. He didn't tell me what it was. So I said, okay, so I have a photo specialist that worked for us. He's not a federal agent or anything. That's all he does in the Air Force is photo analysis. So I took him with us, and I said, "Yeah, what photographs do you have?" And he had 5x8s and 10x12s. He had them on his desk. I said, "Where did you get these, Paul?" He said, "I took them." He said, "Rodney, my photographer took them." I'm looking at him. I said, "Well, where did he take him?" And he told me, coming back from Red River or Dulce. I said, I thought to myself, holy cow, that's a real one. That's a real UFO. I said, "Do you have negatives?" He said, "Yep, I'm giving them to you." So he goes in the dark and comes out and gives me his negatives. And so I take him back to do an analysis and send him up to headquarters. So now we got a dilemma. Here we are trying to disinform a man about this. And we know that what he was filming initially was drones. And so we're convincing it was UFOs. And now he's showing us UFO pictures. Now he's convincing us it's really UFOs. So I thought, wow. So we had meetings after meetings in our office with different people. We have a phone system called the KY3. It's a secure voice system that we could talk to headquarters on, and we have a number of people in the loop. What do we do? You know? And Paul, at this point, and this is a couple years after he first reported, is going downhill. Paul was a chain smoker. He drank 5 or 6 quarts of Coca-Cola a day. He drank coffee. He didn't eat properly. I had high blood pressure. All these medical problems that Paul had. And they're not working in his favor at all. And then the psychological trauma of dealing with these ETs that's making him go crazy. But to top this all off, Paul calls me at midnight on weeks later after he showed me the photographs. And he was in distress. He said, "You got to come over here right away. You got to come over here right away." I said, "What's wrong, Paul?" He says, "You're not going to believe what I have on my computer." I said, "Okay." So fortunately, I wasn't married during that time. I didn't have a social life. So I said, "Okay, I'll come over." So I get dressed. I call Steve. I couldn't get Steve. I called Jerry. I couldn't get Jerry. And there was this other guy by the name of Alex. So Alex and I, and he was an agent. He wasn't in this particular subject range, and he wasn't really briefed in the program. But he's another person. You always want to have a second person go with you. I went there, and knocked on his door. He brought me in, and Paul was in a state of duress. He was despondent. He was sweating, and it was late fall. So first of all, I was concerned about his health. I said, "Boy, Paul, sit down. Are you all right? Have you taken your meds?" I said, Where's Melissa, his wife, Melissa? She's not here. I said, "Well, let's just sit down and talk right here." No, I got to show you this upstairs." I said, No, Paul. There's something wrong, and I don't want you to be having a heart attack on me or something. Well, Alex was he was a trained medic and had been in the military as a trained medic. So he had medical training. And so he kind of examined him, cursory examination of Paul, and said, his high blood pressure and his pulse is high and all that. I said, "Paul, let's get some medicine in you first." So Paul does. And Paul said, "I need some coffee." I said, "No, you don't need any coffee right now. You need just water. Just drink water." I calmed him down. We sat on the couch. And then after probably 30 minutes, 45 minutes, I said, "Okay, let's go upstairs now. Let's see what you got for me." So we go upstairs and into his office. He has his computer screen. And on this computer screen is this picture of this ET. Now, the ironic part about this is that monitor, and that's another story that we have to go into, is black and white. And this is a colored picture. I mean, I was stunned. But as I looked at it more and more, it looked to me like a picture of a painting. And I'm going to show this in the demonstration, the presentation I have tomorrow. And I looked at that, and of course, Alex and I were not experts. And I said, that's a black and white monitor, and that's a colored picture. How did you do that, Paul? He said, I didn't do it. It just showed up. Wow, that made me think, how did he do that? I'm thinking he's faking this somehow, but I don't know how he would have done that. So anyways, we left and went home, made sure Paul was all right. His wife eventually came home, as I guess she was with one of the grandbabies. And anyway, she came home, so I called, Virginia was this other person that we employed. She was a scientist, not really a computer person, because our computer person was out on another assignment. But she knew a lot more about computers than I did. And of course, this is the early days of computers. I said, I need you, Virginia, I need you to come out and look at this computer. So she came out. She said, I need to take it back to my lab, and looked at it. She did. And she tried to figure out how this picture, a color picture. Well, go back a little bit. Before we took it, I said, Paul, this isn't the monitor you had before. He said, no. Leo Sprinkle and Alan Heide gave me that monitor. I said, when? He said, a few weeks ago they came and talked to me about what I've been doing and what I've been seeing. And they both convinced me that I'm dealing with extraterrestrials. And I said, why didn't you tell me this, Paul? He said, well, I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm telling you now. So we take the computer back, and I'm thinking, these guys planted something on that computer. But Virginia couldn't figure it out. And so she got somebody else involved, and they checked, and hasn't been tampered with. We don't know how. So that's another mystery of the Paul Benowitz case, is how did these things appear on his computer? Now, we had a trump, so to be, I mean, not a trump, but a card trump, trumping something. We had a secret entity that was connected to Paul Benowitz. And that person I can name now was Bill Moore. Bill Moore was recruited by us way back because he had connections with a Soviet scientist. And we used Paul to get information out of the Soviets and so forth. But Paul was also an asset of mine. I mean, I would give him things that I can't get. I would tell him, go out and find this information, and he would do that. And we pay him. So we brought Bill in as a reporter that was interested in what Paul has been doing. And number one, we were testing Paul to determine whether Paul was disclosing anything classified or anything we told him not to disclose. And secondly, whether he would tell Bill things that he hadn't told us. But we find out early on that Paul was 100% faithful. I mean, he wasn't telling anything. All he told Bill Moore was, yeah, I took some pictures. There were probably just Air Force things, and I don't know what they are, and Air Force not telling me. He never told Bill anything. But Bill kept trying to get more and more out, of information. And the problem there is Bill decided he had his own plan. And Bill Moore brought in Leo Sprinkle and Alan Heide without telling us anything. So when all this came to play, I confronted Bill Moore. I said, Bill, why'd you do this? Well, I thought it would help the operation. I said, I run the operation. You don't run the operation. I tell you what to do. You're on my payroll. Maybe I screwed up. Maybe I shouldn't have done it that. And so, that part, we couldn't go back and correct because he had to monitor. And I said, okay, now what you're going to do, Bill, you're going to go back to Leo and Alan Heide and figure out what they put in there, that computer. He said, they didn't put anything in. I've already done that. I said, bull. No, he said, they didn't. They just bought it. They just bought it. It was in the box. So we went and confronted, we didn't go. The FBI went I mean, me going in and saying I'm a OSI agent, okay. 2 FBI agents go in and say, Federal Bureau of Investigations, can't lie to us, we want some information. Well, we got their attention, and they told the FBI exactly what they did, but they didn't put anything on the computer. He said, we didn't do anything in that computer. We just bought it and gave it to him. We convinced him that, yeah, and they both really thought that he was in contact with ETs. Of course, then comes up Dulce, and comes up Myrna Hansen, the girl that was abducted. I mean, all these other stories are sidetracks to the real Paul Benowitz story. Anyways, we finally took care of all that. We took the monitor away, gave him back the old monitor. We kept the monitor that they'd given him, and we sent it up to NSA. Now, if there's some kind of bug in that computer, NSA is going to find it. And so they went up there, and they could never find anything. So we don't know how the signal got into the computer. We don't know how the characters, the alien characters, got into the computer. There's so many things that we don't know about the Paul Benowitz case. Recently, well, within the last 5 years, the government has released some highly redacted documents about Paul Benowitz and about them collecting a computer from him. They said a computer, but it's not a computer. The only thing they took was the monitor, not the computer itself. It was a Commodore computer. You later got an Epson computer. We'd already examined those. And so we just needed to know how, or if there was something in that computer that was able to project an image that we couldn't project, and the image wasn't coming from the computer itself. Because back in those days, I mean, you got a television monitor, but a computer monitor doesn't display those things. You can't display those things back in those days. In fact, we even went as far as to contact the company that made the monitor. Well, I didn't, but our experts did. And I remember Virginia came into my office one day and said, Richard, look, I got the report back from Commodore, or the company that made it, said, it's impossible. You can't get an image on there. It's impossible. I said, well, we did. How we did it, we don't know. And now, over the years, experts are saying it can be burnt on to the older computers, which could have been what he did somehow, but I don't think he did it. I think somebody else did it. I think Leo Sprinkle or Alan Heining did it, but I don't know how they did it. And of course, I left government service, and it's not interesting. Paul Benowitz passed away, and the operation's fully over with, and so I don't know any more than that about how he did what he did. But Paul definitely tapped into something that was out of this world, and that was ETs. But I like to think that that's the main story, but that's a side story. Our mission to disinform him, to convince him that it was UFOs and not highly classified aircrafts, was very successful. But it went beyond that, because he really was in contact with UFOs. Right. He took pictures of them.
Right. Well, keeping in line with the theme of this conference, which is the role of consciousness and going beyond the nuts and bolts of ufology, I'm wondering what the Paul Benowitz case has taught you in terms of why is this disinformation campaign so strong, and what is the government or the powers that we're so afraid of if us as the public were to really know, in terms of awareness, that ETs do exist?
One of the problems is that it's such a mystery. We don't have, our government doesn't have all the answers. And that scares the government. When the United States government goes out on a project, they want to know all the answers, especially if there's a threat, some kind of threat to society or humanity here on Earth. President Reagan was briefed into the program during his term, And because of what he was told, and I don't know what he was told, although the transcripts have been released, some of the transcripts have been released on how his briefing. He was so scared that he tasked Brent Scowcroft and some of the other scientific people within his administration to develop some kind of a network where we can protect Earth. And then it became the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. That was the program that was started back in the early 80s under President Reagan. They perfected a lot of things over the years, although I don't know exactly what they perfected. So there was a consciousness within the government at that time, because President Reagan, he said many things about the threats coming from space and what if this happens. He told Spielberg that E.T., E.T. was, you don't know how real that movie really is, and things like that. And then carrying on, there's other people within the Congress, both the Senate and the House, that had been briefed into the program. Barry Goldwater and some of the other, Fife Sumington was another one, who was really worried about the hostile ETs, because there was incidents that happened that I don't even want to talk about, and others know about but don't talk about, that involved ETs killing people and abducting people and making them disappear and so forth and so on. So all that information got to President Reagan, and so he wants to protect society. Now, the question.
Can I just stop you
sure.
1 second? Protect Earth from what?
From the hostile aliens.
Okay, just wanted to properly identify.
Yes.
That.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And so there's so many entities within our government involved in the program. You have the beginning of the 1940s, or middle of the Roswell incident, 1947. The Army Air Force is involved. We didn't have an intelligence agency. We used the Army intelligence as an intelligence agency. In 1947, September 1947, the United States Air Force was created. The Central Intelligence Agency was created. In 1961, the Defense Intelligence Agency was created. The Air Force had Project Blue Book right up until 1969 and the Condom Report. And the Condom Report wrote what the Air Force wanted it to write. I mean, it was a joke, really, reading that. But the Air Force had all this material, all these documents, thousands and thousands of pages of this and that, and files, and they don't know what to do with them. So they said, well, who wants this stuff? And well, the Defense Intelligence Agency, being a relatively new agency from 1961, in 1969, they raised their hand and said, we'll take it. That gives us a mission. So everything was turned over to the Defense Intelligence Agency. But ironically, the Air Force still kept an investigative unit to investigate these things, because they were occurring all the time. Pilots were seeing UFOs, ground-based radar was tracking UFOs, planes were chasing and trying to shoot down UFOs. So the Air Force had to have some entities still involved in that, and that was the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. So there was still a connection. Now, DIA was collecting information, OSI, or the Air Force was collecting information, the United States Navy was collecting information, the CIA was collecting information, NSA was collecting signals from we don't know where, the National Reconnaissance Office, which was at one time a highly classified agency, was collecting information. Now you got all these different agencies within a government collecting information. Now today they want disclosure. Well, they want disclosure from who? Every single one of these agencies have to get together and combine what they know, synchronize it all, and release it. But that's not happening. Disclosure right now is only the Department of Defense Inspector General. And the DODIG, he only wants to talk about what's happened since 2004. He doesn't want to touch the historical aspects of it. And the recent congressional hearings, the questions were asked to these two experts, so-called experts, about Roswell and about some other incidents, and they couldn't answer any of those questions. In fact, he said, I was never briefed into Roswell. I don't know anything about Roswell. Now, if you want disclosure, you have to start from the beginning. And as far as I know, now, I may be wrong. I mean, other people have told me you were never briefed into the entire program because this happened back in 1920s. Well, okay, I know what I was briefed into, and that was in 1979, and that pertained to what happened from Roswell on. Now, maybe something happened before, and I was never aware of. But I said, we need to go back to Roswell. We need to start there and release what we can from that point on forward. Now, I understand there's things that you can't release. Anything dealing with methods and techniques used to collect, okay, I understand that. And maybe exotic technology that we got from ETs that we want to reverse engineer. Okay, I understand all that. We don't have to release that stuff. But the fact that we have been visited, we know we've been visited, we have 5, well, at the time I was briefed, 5 distinct civilizations, extraterrestrial civilizations, we know that have contact with Earth. That's what we need to tell American people. Or the world, not just the American people, but the entire world, humanity.
Absolutely. Do you believe that disclosure is essential for ascension?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But that's not going to happen. The government's not going to disclose everything. Because right now, I know, being still have inside information, I know the Air Force is never going to release what they have. And now there's a new branch of the military called the U.S. Space Command. They're not going to, or Space Force, excuse me, they're now tasked with all the UFO stuff. Now that's so highly classified that they're not even going to admit to anything. So all they have now is what people saw and what people within the military saw and did and what they collected that is open source material. That's not going to tell the entire story. You have to dig in and release some of this classified stuff. And that's not going to happen. I can almost guarantee you that the disclosure it might go forward in an accelerated way, but not with the government behind it. We have to do it ourselves. We have to get people from within, and I have many that are standing at the doorway. And once they got their clearance, once the government told them they could talk, they'd be out here in a half a second telling what they know. Just for an example, I have a person, a good friend, who still works in the DIA, been there for a long time. When this disclosure first came out, started talking about disclosure back in 2017, there was a radio talk show in the DC area, and they were interviewing a spokesman from the Pentagon. And this female that was the broadcaster, the narrator of this morning show in DC, asked him, what information is going to be released in the disclosure? And he said, whatever they give us to release. Now, whatever they give us, that's not going to be everything. And my partner, my buddy that's still in DIA says, I wish they would come to me and ask me about disclosure, because I can turn around and I have 6 filing cabinets full of stuff that would blow this wide open. Let them come into my office and ask me that question. I'll be gladly open those filing cabinets.
And Richard, you are a courageous part of this underground disclosure movement. I'm wondering, on a personal note, do you ever fear for your life?
I've been concerned. I've had things happen. I've had people plant or post signs in my yard. I'd been followed. I've been visited by the FBI, but not so much as threatening me. I did a presentation once, not very long ago, just before COVID. And about a week later, 2 FBI agents came and said, you know what, Richard, according to the government, you overstepped your bounds. You talked about things you should never talked about. I have to admit, I did. I told him, yeah, I fully admit I did. He said, the agent says, just don't do it again. That's it. I mean, the conversation lasted 30 minutes, and I said, okay, what am I going to be under investigation? No, he said, we just want to tell you not to do it again. And I said, okay, I'm not going to. I'm not going to discuss that subject ever again. And I haven't, and I'm not going to. So, yeah, there's times when I have crossed the line. Fearing for my life, I've had hundreds and hundreds of critics sending me emails. I get probably 100 emails a week, at least, sometimes more, sometimes less. And most of them are so positive, fans, my fan base, I mean, I'm from Gaia, and which a lot of them are here. I mean, a couple came all the way from Illinois just to see me and talk to me. So I'm not so much worried. Some of the critics send subtle threats, but not so much anymore. I mean, in the early days I did, but now the critics are more organized in their thoughts and questions, and I always answer everything, unless it's laced with profanity or threats, something like that. I'm going to just delete them and put them in junk mail or block them. But if they ask me legitimate questions, I answer almost every one of them. I spend a lot of time on my computer answering these emails, and so I'm not at all threatened. In fact, I tell the story about my nicest critic, a beloved person. He's a retired priest. He is enthused about the subject, but he doesn't believe everything that I'm saying. He sent me an email a long time ago, and he's been my friend for a long time on Facebook and email. And it was somewhat critical, but he signed it, retired father so-and-so, a Catholic priest. I was raised Catholic. I was a altar boy and religious training. So I wrote him back, and it was a nice letter, and I said, I answered everything he asked me. But then he told me a story about, one of his experience when he went to the Vatican about not being able to go in one portion of he was doing a study on exorcism, and he had supposedly full reign of the basement and libraries of the Vatican, but when he was trying to get back to one area, the Swiss guard stopped him and said, you can't come back here, Father. He said, why? I'm supposed to have access. Nope, not here. So he went up and asked to a Monsignor, I can't get into, aisle or whatever it was. He said, no, that's information. There's information in there that the Catholic Church don't ever want to acknowledge. He didn't know what that was. He doesn't know what that means or what it meant. He never got there. But he said, that made me think about a lot of things. And maybe there is. He's open-minded now. He still sends me emails.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. And
you're very welcome.
It's Richard Doty, government whistleblower, literally blowing the lid off classified information. Thank you so much, Richard. I can't wait to hear more in your presentation tomorrow.
You're very welcome, Kristen. Thank you.